Imagine for a moment a company, not a state, but a company with its own private army, its own navy, the power to start wars and potentially to rule over millions of people. This wasn't a country, this was a corporation. And for over 200 years, companies in the age of imperialism didn't just participate in the global economy, they outright controlled it. And so in today's video, you guys, we're going to be breaking down the world of merchant kings. These were basically corporations, trading companies that eventually became private empires, how they fought over each other for global dominance, and the one rule that they all had to learn in order for them to survive in this new globalized world that they created.
In the early 1600s, Europe was expanding. The age of imperialism has begun. However, they wasn't just expanding through government and state armies. No, their first era of expansion was through companies. The Dutch East India Company, otherwise known as the VOC, was the world's first true multinational corporations. It created the notion of capitalism, the notion of shareholders, board of directors, and something that no company today has ever had the right to do, the legal right to wage war. It could build forts, control trade routes, eliminate competition, well, buy a barrel of a gun. Spices weren't just flavoring and seasonings on food, but they were, at that time, a symbol of wealth, power, survival, and most importantly, status. But the British East India Company took things a whole nother step further than any other merchant corporation ever in human history. What started out as a mere small trading operation, it eventually became a governing power, a state within a state, almost like a deep state as we know it today. It collected taxes, controlled armies, and eventually will go over and rule over 200 million people in the Indian subcontinent. For all intents and purposes, this wasn't colonization by a nation. It was control by a corporation. And so these companies, whether it would be the Dutch, the British, or the French, weren't just colonizing nations all over the world. They were competing. They all fought over trade routes, spices, silks, and most importantly, access to Asia. And this eventually didn't just become a simple competition of economic and political, it became militarily. These companies, whether it was the British East India Company, the Dutch East Indies, these companies had built armies, hired mercenaries, and eventually would go to war with each other. In this era of globalization, they didn't just begin with peace, but also began with corporate warfare. But here was the most important part of this story. Even though these companies had ruled over millions of peoples and had the access and the legal right to wage war, they too had also had limits. Because at the end of the day, they also had to answer to their big bosses back in Europe. And so they couldn't grow too powerful without triggering resistance, and not just resistance from the nation that they had conquered, but also from each other. Because if one company controlled too much trade, it would then threaten the balance of power and entire empires and kingdoms back in Europe. And so for this reason, alliances began to form. Rivalry still intensified, but the dominant players were always constantly checked each other. Eventually, over the centuries, something had changed. The governments began to realize that these companies will just become way too powerful for them to control. And so they eventually did control it. The British Crown then absorbed the East India Company. The other companies were either dismantled or outright regulated. And so the age of corporate warfare and empires ruling the vast oceans and seas was ending, or at least it appeared to be. What this period reveals is something deeper than history. It reveals a simple pattern. In that power doesn't stay in one form, it shifts. Whether it be from kingdoms back in Europe, to the companies, and also to the states. But the logic has always remained the same.
The merchant kings with their own private armies, their own navies, and their ability to rule millions of people are now over. Or are they? The system they built is gone. But the players look slightly different. Nations, multinational corporations of tech giants, networks, they all follow the same rule. No one is allowed to become too powerful. And once you understand that, you would then start to understand everything else.